I am glad to welcome you to my channel Sinister Horror Stories. Before we start the story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Jack Thompson had been driving trucks for nearly 25 years. He'd seen every kind of weather, every kind of road, and every kind of trouble a man could face behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. But none of that prepared him for the hellish night he was about to endure. The job seemed straightforward enough, a run-up to a small town in the northern U.S., cut off by one of the winter storms in recent memory. They needed emergency supplies, food, fuel, and medicine. Jack was the only one willing to take the job. The pay was good, but it wasn't the money that motivated him, it was the challenge. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to get the job done, no matter what. He set out late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The radio crackled with warnings, advising drivers to stay off the roads, but Jack paid them no mind. As he left the last signs of civilization behind, the road ahead of him became a white blur. The snow was falling so heavily that his headlights seemed to reflect back at him, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of the truck. The wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and the wind howled around the cab, shaking the truck as its way through the drifts. The miles ticked by slowly, the monotony of the snow-covered road broken only by the occasional flash of a road sign or the silhouette of a tree bent low under the weight of the snow. Jack kept the radio on low, the steady hum of the engine and the crackling voices of distant stations a comforting backdrop to the storm raging outside. It wasn't until he was deep into the mountains, far from any town or gas station, that he began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. The road had been deserted for hours, and the storm was getting. The snow was now falling so heavily that it was like driving through a tunnel. The world outside reduced to a narrow of white, barely visible through the windshield. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something. A shadowy figure standing by the side of the road, just on the edge of his headlights. He glanced over, but by the time he did, it was gone. Just the tricks of the light, he told himself, his mind playing tricks in the snow and darkness. But the unease didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts as he pushed the truck onward. Another hour passed, and the figure appeared again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the road, forcing Jack to swerve to avoid hitting it. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to keep the truck under control, the wheels slipping on the icy road. When he finally brought the truck to a stop, he looked back, but there was no one there. The road was empty, the only sign of life the tracks his tires had left in the snow. "What the hell?" Jack muttered to himself, his breath fogging up the inside of the cab. He was a man of reason, a man who believed in what he could see and touch. But this was something else. He shook his head, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. It was just the storm, just the isolation playing tricks on him. That's all. But as he continued driving, the shadows seemed to gather at the edges of his vision, flitting through the snow like ghosts. The radio, which had been his constant companion, began to fade in and out, the music and voices distorted by static. Occasionally he'd catch a word or two, but they were garbled, unintelligible, like someone whispering through a long, dark tunnel. Jack turned the volume up, hoping the familiar sounds would calm his nerves, but the static only grew louder, the whispers more insistent. He slammed the radio off in frustration, the silence that followed almost then the noise. Then came the knocking. It started softly, a gentle tap, tap, tap on the back of the truck, like something or someone was inside the trailer. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white as he the urge to pull over and check. But what would he find? There was nothing back there but the load he was hauling. Nothing but boxes and crates and... The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and Jack's resolve broke. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the engine idling as he sat there, staring at the darkness in the rearview mirror. The snow was falling heavier now, the wind whipping it into drifts against the side of the truck. The knocking continued, louder still, echoing through the metal frame of the cab. Jack grabbed his flashlight and opened the door. He climbed down from the cab and made his way to the back of the truck, his boots crunching in the snow. The wind tore at his clothes, freezing his breath in front of his face, but he ignored it, his focus on the trailer. He unlocked the doors and threw them open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cargo was just as he'd left it, neatly stacked and secured, not a box out of place. But the knocking hadn't stopped. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the trailer, somewhere just out of reach. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. There was no answer, just the relentless tap, tap, tap of something unseen. He climbed up into the trailer, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the crates and boxes. There was nothing there, nothing that could be making that noise, but the knocking continued, louder now, almost frantic. Jack turned, ready to get the hell out of there, when he saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the trailer, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in the tattered remains of a trucker's uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him with those dead eyes. Then, slowly, it began to walk toward him, its footsteps silent on the metal floor. Jack backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. The figure didn't stop, didn't even seem to hear him. It just kept coming, its movement slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Jack stumbled out of the trailer, slamming the doors shut behind him. He fumbled with the lock, his hands numb with cold and fear, and then ran back to the cab, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and Jack slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning on the icy road before finding traction. He didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirrors. He just drove, pushing the truck as fast as it would go, the engine straining under the load. The road ahead was a blur, the snow whipping past the windshield in a dizzying swirl. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. It wasn't real, couldn't be real. He was just tired, just stressed, that's all. The storm was messing with his head, making him see things that weren't there. But the knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, coming from all sides, like the truck was surrounded by unseen hands, beating on the metal walls. Jack gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, his heart pounding in his chest. The road twisted and turned, the snowbanks rising higher, the trees closing in on either side. And then, in the distance, Jack saw it. A light, faint and flickering, like a beacon in the storm. He pushed the truck harder, the engine groaning in protest, but the light grew closer, brighter, until he could make out the shape of a small building. A truck stop, half buried in snow. Jack pulled into the parking lot, the tires skidding on the ice as he brought the truck to a stop. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his breath fogging up the windows. The knocking had stopped, the silence almost deafening in its absence. He opened the door and stepped out, his legs shaking as he made his way to the truck stop. The sign above the door was half broken, the letters faded and cracked, but the lights inside were warm and inviting. Jack pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly, and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee, their eyes on the small television mounted in the corner. They barely looked up as Jack entered, their faces lined with exhaustion and the weariness of the road. Jack made his way to the counter, his hands still trembling as he sat down. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, poured him a cup of coffee without a word. Jack wrapped his hands around the cup, the warmth seeping into his skin, but it did little to calm his nerves. "Rough night?" the waitress asked, her voice flat, uninterested. Jack nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was hot and bitter, the taste grounding him in reality. "You could say that." The waitress nodded, wiping down the counter with a rag. "Storm's been hell. Roads are all but closed. You're lucky you made it here." "Yeah," Jack muttered, staring into his coffee. "Lucky." He didn't tell her about the figure in the trailer, about the knocking, about the dead eyes that still haunted his thoughts. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. It had to be the storm, the isolation, playing tricks on his mind. That was the only explanation. But as he sat there, trying to convince himself that it was all in his head, the door to the truck stop opened, letting in a blast of cold air. Jack looked up, his heart skipping a beat. But it was just another trucker, bundled up against the cold. The man nodded to Jack as he made his way to the counter, and Jack nodded back, forcing a smile. But something was wrong. The man's face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. Jack watched him out of the corner of his eye, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. The man sat down at the counter, his back to Jack, and ordered a coffee. The waitress poured it for him, her movements slow and lethargic, as if she were moving through water. The trucker took the cup in his hands, staring into the black liquid like it held all the answers. Then he turned to Jack, and Jack's blood ran cold. It was the same man, the same pale face, the same hollow eyes, the same trucker's uniform, now dry and clean, but unmistakable. The man smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "Leaving already?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I thought you were just getting started." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The other truckers sat at the counter, their faces blank and expressionless, like they were frozen in time. The waitress continued wiping down the counter, her movements mechanical and unseeing. Jack stood up, knocking his stool over in his haste. He backed away, his eyes never leaving the trucker's face. The man's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something dark and malevolent. "You can't leave," the trucker said, his voice echoing in Jack's ears. "Not yet. Not until you finish what you started." Jack turned and ran, the door to the truck stop slamming shut behind him. He sprinted to his truck, his breath fogging up the inside of the cab as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and Jack tore out of the parking lot, the tires spinning on the ice. He didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirrors. He just drove, pushing the truck as fast as it would go, the road a blur of white and darkness. The knocking started again, louder this time, echoing through the cab like a drumbeat. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was he going crazy? Was this some kind of nightmare? But the cold, the snow, the road beneath his tires, it all felt too real, too solid. He had to keep going, had to outrun whatever was chasing him, whatever was haunting him. The road twisted and turned, the snowbanks rising higher, the trees closing in on either side. Jack's hands were slick with sweat, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was out there was desperate to get in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Jack looked around, his heart still pounding in his chest. The road was empty, the snow falling softly now, the storm beginning to clear. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating in its completeness. He slowed the truck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights of a small town appeared on the horizon, the first signs of civilization he'd seen in hours. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with something darker, something that told him this wasn't over. Jack pulled into the town, the truck rumbling to a stop outside the small general store. He sat there for a moment, his hands still trembling, his mind racing. The knocking was gone, the figure in the trailer gone, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He climbed down from the cab, his legs shaky, and made his way into the store. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the warmth hit him like a wave. The store was small, cozy, the shelves lined with canned goods and winter supplies. A few locals milled about, their faces lined with the weariness of the storm. Jack approached the counter, the store owner looking up with a tired smile. "Long night?" the man asked, his voice warm and friendly. Jack nodded, his throat dry. "You could say that." The store owner chuckled, ringing up Jack's purchases. "You're the first truck we've seen in days. Roads have been hell. You're lucky you made it here." "Yeah," Jack muttered, handing over the cash. "Lucky." He left the store, the cold air hitting him like a slap to the face. The truck loomed in the distance, a silent sentinel in the snow. Jack hesitated, his breath fogging up in front of him. He didn't want to get back in, didn't want to face whatever was waiting for him. But he had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let some ghost or whatever it was stop him. He climbed back into the cab, the seat cold and unwelcoming. The knocking had stopped, the figure gone, but the memory of those hollow eyes still lingered, still haunted his thoughts. Jack started the engine, the truck rumbling to life, and pulled out of the parking lot. The road ahead was clear, the storm having passed. The lights of the town faded into the distance, the road stretching out before him like a dark ribbon. Jack drove on, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes narrowed in concentration. But the fear never left him. It clung to him like a shadow, whispering in his ear, taunting him with the memory of what he'd seen. The road was empty, the snow falling softly now, but Jack knew he wasn't alone. The figure was out there, somewhere, waiting for him, watching him. And Jack knew that no matter how far he drove, no matter how fast he went, he could never outrun it. The road was full of stories, full of secrets best left undisturbed. Jack had learned that the hard way, and he knew he'd never forget it. He drove on through the night, the road stretching out before him, endless and unforgiving. Thank you for listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Share your impressions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.